The canyon walls were bleeding red in the late afternoon sun when Cole Mercer heard the scream. Not a human sound at first, but something sharper, more animal, torn from the throat of someone who knew death was close and had stopped pretending otherwise. He'd been riding alone for 3 days, which was how he preferred it, moving through the empty stretches of New Mexico territory where the only company was wind and stone and the occasional buzzard circling overhead, but that scream cut through the stillness like a blade through silk and made his horse stutter beneath him with ears pinned back in primal recognition of danger. Cole didn't think, didn't weigh his options or consider the risk. He just dug his heels into the horse's flanks and rode hard toward the sound because something in that cry bypassed every wall he'd built around himself over the years and went straight to the part of him that still remembered what it felt like to care. When he rounded the narrow bend where the canyon twisted like a broken spine, he saw her, a young woman backed against the rust-colored rock face with nowhere left to run. And even from 30 yards away he could see she was Apache by the intricate beadwork on her belt and the way her hair fell in a single dark braid down her back, thick and shining, even covered in dust. 3 wolves circled her with the slow, deliberate movements of predators who knew their prey was already finished, the bodies lean and desperate, ribs showing through matted fur that spoke of a hard winter and too many hungry nights, and she had a knife gripped in her right hand while her left arm hung useless at her side, blood soaking through the torn fabric of her sleeve and dripping steadily onto the canyon floor. Her leg was torn too, a vicious gash that ran from mid-thigh to knee, and she was breathing in sharp, controlled bursts, her eyes locked on the largest wolf as if she could will it to back down through sheer force of defiance. Cole didn't hesitate or announce himself or try to calculate the best approach. He just yanked his rifle from its saddle holster and fired a shot into the dirt between the woman and the wolves, and the crack echoed off the canyon walls like thunder rolling through a summer storm, sending the animals scattering in 3 different directions for just a heartbeat before their hunger dragged them back. But that heartbeat was enough for Cole to kick his horse forward, shouting words he didn't even register. And when the largest wolf gathered itself and lunged back toward her with teeth bared in murder in its yellow eyes, he swung the rifle butt in a wide arc that connected with the animal's skull with a sickening thud that reverberated up through his arms. The wolf yelped and twisted away, stunned and bleeding, and the other 2 finally broke their circle and bolted into the rocks, their nerves shattered by the sudden presence of a bigger predator. She collapsed the instant the wolves disappeared, her legs giving out as if someone had cut the strings holding her upright, and Cole was off his horse before she hit the ground, catching her under the arms and feeling the full weight of her body sag against him. She couldn't have weighed more than 100 pounds, small and compact in the way of people who'd grown up running through desert mountains, but the warmth of her body against his chest sent a jolt through him that he wasn't remotely prepared for because he hadn't touched another person in years. Not since the war. Not since he'd learned in the hardest way possible that closeness only meant having something to lose, and that loss was the cruelest teacher of all. Her hand came up weakly and gripped his collar, fingers digging into the worn leather of his vest with surprising strength for someone who'd just nearly been torn apart, and she was trying to speak, her lips moving in shapes he couldn't decipher, forming words in a language that sounded like water running over stones, musical and ancient and completely incomprehensible to him. Her eyes found his through the haze of pain and shock, dark and fierce and burning with something that looked almost like recognition, as if she'd been expecting him or waiting for him or had seen his face in some dream she'd had weeks ago. And she whispered something that rose at the end like a question, a single phrase that hung in the air between them like smoke from a fire that wouldn't quite go out. Cole lifted her carefully, sliding one arm beneath her knees and the other around her back, cradling her against his chest as he stood, and her blood immediately began soaking into his shirt, warm and sticky and far too much of it, and he could feel her heartbeat against his ribs through the layers of fabric and muscle, fast and fragile and fighting with everything it had left. He didn't know why she was alone out here in the emptiest part of the territory where even the Apache rarely traveled. Didn't know why wolves had come for her in full daylight, which almost never happened unless the pack was starving or rabid. And he didn't know why when her fingers tightened on his collar and her head fell against his shoulder with a weight that felt like trust. Something deep inside him that he thought had died somewhere in the mud of Virginia woke up sudden and fierce and absolutely refused to go back to sleep. Inside the cabin, The air was thick with the smell of smoke and old leather and something metallic that Cole recognized as blood, and the silence between them felt heavier than any conversation he'd had in the past 5 years as he laid her carefully on the narrow bed near the stone fireplace and began gathering what he needed to keep her alive. His hands moved with practiced efficiency, lighting the oil lamp, stoking the fire until it threw dancing shadows across the rough timber walls, pulling out his medical kit that he'd kept stocked more out of habit than necessity because he'd stopped believing he'd ever use it on another human being. But when he turned back to her and saw how still she lay, how pale her face had become beneath the dust and dried blood, his hands started shaking in a way they hadn't shaken since the war. Tala watched him as he cut away the torn fabric of her sleeve and began cleaning the ragged wounds on her shoulder, her dark eyes following every movement he made, tracking the way his jaw tightened when he had to press the cloth deeper to stop the bleeding, noticing how he kept his gaze fixed on the injury itself and never on her face, observing the scars that crisscrossed his knuckles like a map of old violence, and the way his voice, when he finally spoke to tell her this would hurt, came out, quiet and fractured as if he'd forgotten how to use it for anything but talking to himself. She didn't cry out when he poured whiskey over the shoulder wound, didn't flinch when he stitched it closed with thread that bit into raw flesh. She just kept watching him with an intensity that made him more uncomfortable than the blood or the proximity or the fact that he could smell sage and wood smoke in her head despite everything she'd been through. When Cole finished bandaging her leg and tried to pull away, physically and emotionally retreating toward the far side of the cabin like a man who'd just realized he'd gotten too close to a fire, Tala spoke for the first time in English, her voice low and steady despite the pain that had to be radiating through every nerve in her body. "Why would a man who lives like a ghost risk his life for a stranger?" she asked. And the question landed in the small cabin like a stone dropped into still water, sending ripples through defenses he'd spent years building. Cole froze with his back to her, his shoulders going rigid, and he didn't answer right away because no one had asked him a direct question like that in longer than he could remember. No one had looked past the surface of his isolation and seen the shape of what he was hiding underneath. He tried to deflect, turning slightly but still not meeting her eyes, his voice coming out rougher than he intended when he said, "Just heal. Then you go," as if saying it firmly enough would make it true, as if he could push her away with words the same way he'd pushed away everyone else who'd tried to get close over the years. But Tala didn't look away, didn't accept the dismissal. She just held his gaze with those dark, knowing eyes that seemed to read things in him that he'd never spoken aloud, things about guilt that sat in his chest like stones, about the people he couldn't save and the ones he'd failed, about the way he'd chosen this isolation not as peace but as punishment for still being alive when better men weren't. The silence stretched between them, taut and trembling, and Cole realized with something close to panic that she wasn't going to let him hide, that somehow this wounded woman who should have been focused on her own survival had decided instead to see straight through every wall he'd ever built, and he didn't know whether that terrified him or gave him the first real breath he'd taken in years. Over the next 2 days, Tala's body began to heal with the stubborn resilience of someone who'd spent their entire life moving through harsh landscapes that didn't forgive weakness. And on the 3rd morning she attempted to stand on her own, gripping the edge of the wooden table and pushing herself upright with a determination that made Cole look up sharply from where he was cleaning his rifle near the window. He saw her legs tremble, saw the way her injured thigh couldn't bear the weight she was asking it to hold, and he was across the cabin before she could fall, catching her around the waist with one arm while his other hand found hers, steadying her against his chest in a moment of physical closeness that made both of them go very still. Her hand pressed flat against his heart, feeling it hammer beneath worn cotton, and she looked up at him with something in her eyes that wasn't gratitude or embarrassment but recognition, as if she'd just confirmed something she'd suspected all along about the kind of man who lived alone in the wilderness and pretended he didn't need anyone. That night, with the fire burning low and the darkness pressing against the cabin windows like something alive, Tala finally told him why she'd been alone in that canyon. And her voice carried no shame or regret when she explained that her uncle had chosen a husband for her, a warrior from a neighboring band who was respected and wealthy and completely wrong, and that she'd refused the marriage not out of childish rebellion, but because she'd looked at the life stretching ahead of her and seen a slow death of everything that made her who she was. She'd left the camp before dawn one morning, taking only her knife and a water skin and the conviction that she could survive alone the way men did, that she could prove her freedom wasn't something to be given or taken away but something that belonged to her by right. And the wolves had found her on the 5th day when she was still learning the difference between confidence and preparedness, still discovering that choosing your own path meant accepting every consequence that came with it. Cole listened without interrupting, his eyes fixed on the fire but his attention completely on her words, and he saw in her defiance and strength and pain a mirror of something he'd felt himself, the desperate need to break away from what others expected, to carve out a life that was yours even if it cost you everything else. She saw it too, saw the way his jaw tightened when she talked about leaving her people behind, saw the loneliness he tried to hide beneath layers of routine and silence and self-imposed exile. And when she asked him quietly what had happened 3 winters ago, naming the specific time frame as if she'd somehow measured the depth of his grief by the way he moved through the world, Cole felt something inside him crack open like ice breaking under spring sun. He told her everything, the words coming out slow and painful like pulling arrows from flesh, about how the raiders had come while he was away hunting, how he'd returned to find his cabin burned and his wife and daughter buried in shallow graves by neighbors who hadn't been able to stop what happened, how he tracked those men across 2 territories and killed every single one of them with a coldness that frightened him more than their deaths ever could. He told her about the emptiness that followed, the way he'd isolated himself not because he wanted peace but because he believed he didn't deserve it, because he'd failed the only people who'd ever mattered and no amount of revenge could bring them back or erase the fact that he'd been miles away when they needed him most. Tala didn't offer pity or empty comfort or any of the hollow words people usually spoke when confronted with grief that enormous. Instead, she rose slowly from her chair despite the pain still radiating through her leg and crossed the small distance between them, standing close enough that he could feel the warmth of her body in the cool cabin air. She reached up and placed both hands on either side of his face, forcing him to look at her, forcing him to see the fierce certainty in her eyes when she said, "You are a man who carries fire and thinks it is ash," and the truth of those words hit him like a physical blow because she'd seen through his self-imposed narrative of worthlessness and named the thing he'd been too afraid to acknowledge, that beneath all his guilt and isolation, something in him was still burning, still alive, still capable of caring enough to ride into danger for a stranger's scream. This became the moment everything shifted between them. When 2 people who'd been broken by different kinds of loss recognized in each other not weakness but the terrible courage it took to keep breathing when every reason to do so had been stripped away, and when Tala pulled him into an embrace that was fierce and grounding and completely free of expectation. Cole let himself be held for the first time in 3 years and felt something long dormant stir beneath the ashes of who he used to be. The dust came first, a thin golden cloud rising against the horizon like smoke from a distant fire, and Cole saw it through the cabin window while he was sharpening his knife at the table, his body going still with the kind of alertness that came from years of knowing when danger was approaching even before it announced itself. Tala saw his reaction and pulled herself upright despite the pain still lancing through her leg, moving to the window with a limp that spoke of determination stronger than damaged muscle. And when she saw the line of riders materializing out of the desert shimmer, her expression shifted into something complicated, a mixture of relief and dread and fierce resolve that told Cole these weren't strangers coming to harm her, but something potentially more dangerous. People who had claims on her that went deeper than violence. The Apache search party arrived with a measured pace of men who'd already found what they were looking for and were now deciding what to do about it. 7 riders in all, their horses dark against the pale earth, and when they stopped 20 yards from the cabin, Tala was already standing in the doorway despite Cole's quiet protest, refusing to hide or cower or give anyone the impression that she needed protecting from her own people. Her father dismounted first, a man whose age showed in the silver threading through his long hair but whose bearing carried the unmistakable authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question, and his eyes moved from his daughter's bandaged wounds to the white man standing slightly behind her with a hand resting on the doorframe, assessing the situation with the kind of careful intelligence that made Cole understand immediately that this wasn't a man who acted on impulse or anger, but the warrior who dismounted second, younger and harder with a face carved from stone and fury, radiated a different kind of energy entirely. And when he stepped forward with his hand on the knife at his belt, Cole recognized the look of a man who believed something had been stolen from him and was calculating whether he could take it back by force. "You dishonor your family," Red Hawk said to Tala in heavily accented English, his voice low and dangerous, the word clipped short as if speaking them caused him physical pain. "You will return with us now. This foolishness ends today." His eyes flicked to Cole with undisguised hatred, seeing not the man who'd saved her life but the white intruder who'd somehow inserted himself into matters that weren't his concern, and the air between them crackled with a promise of violence barely held in check. Tala stepped forward then, putting weight on her injured leg that made her wince but refusing to show weakness in front of the assembled men. And when she spoke, her voice carried across the dusty space between the cabin and the riders with perfect clarity, each word deliberate and final. "I choose my own path," she said, not as a plea or explanation but as a statement of fact, something that existed independent of anyone's approval or understanding. And the way she said it made several of the warriors shift uncomfortably in their saddles because they recognized the particular kind of determination that couldn't be argued with or beaten down, the same quality that had made her leave in the first place. Her father studied her for a long moment, his weathered face unreadable, and then his gaze moved to Cole, assessing him in a way that felt like being examined under glass, weighing character and intent and the nature of whatever had developed between his daughter and this solitary white man in the days since the wolves. When he finally spoke, his English was better than Red Hawk's, measured and precise, carrying the weight of someone delivering a judgment he'd already made. "We respect your choice, daughter," he said, the words clearly costing him something but spoken with genuine acceptance. "But some men do not accept loss. They nurse it like a wound that will not heal." His eyes shifted deliberately to Red Hawk, then back to Cole. "Watch the shadows, stranger. They remember your face now. And not all debts are paid in daylight." Red Hawk's expression twisted into something murderous, his hand tightening on his knife handle until his knuckles went white. And for a heartbeat Cole thought the young warrior might attack right there despite the presence of the elder, might decide that his wounded pride was worth whatever consequences would follow. But the moment passed. Red Hawk spat into the dust at his feet and mounted his horse with violent grace, wheeling the animal around so hard it reared slightly. And the look he gave Cole before riding away was a promise written in fury and humiliation, the kind of look that said this confrontation was merely postponed, not resolved. The search party departed the way they'd come, dissolving back into the desert heat. And the tension that had been coiled tight in Cole's shoulders didn't release because he understood with perfect clarity that the elder's warning wasn't dramatic posturing but simple truth, that somewhere out in those vast empty spaces, Red Hawk was already planning his return, already imagining the ways he could reclaim what he believed had been taken from him, and that the dust settling behind the departing riders was just the pause between storms, not the end of the weather. The days that followed carried a softness Cole had forgotten could exist, a quiet rhythm of shared tasks and careful healing that transformed the cabin from a place of exile into something that felt dangerously close to home. And he found himself noticing small things he'd stopped seeing years ago, the way morning light fell across the wooden floor in golden stripes, the sound of Tala's voice humming old songs while she cleaned vegetables for their evening meal, the particular quality of silence that existed between two people who'd grown comfortable enough with each other that words became optional rather than necessary. Her body mended with each passing day, the angry red of her wounds fading to pink and then to white scars that she traced sometimes with her fingertips as if mapping the geography of her own survival. And Cole watched her grow stronger with feelings he didn't know how to name, something beyond relief or satisfaction. Something that felt like watching spring return after a winter he'd believed would last forever. They fell into patterns without discussing them, Cole teaching her to handle his rifle properly so she'd never be defenseless again. Tala showing him how to identify edible plants he'd walked past 1,000 times without recognizing their value. And in the evenings they sat by the fire with coffee or sometimes whiskey, talking about everything and nothing, about the childhoods they'd left behind and the people they'd loved and lost, about dreams they'd abandoned and the strange paths that had led them both to that canyon where wolves circled and fate intervened. There were moments of laughter too, genuine and startling, Like when Tala tried to teach him an Apache word for stubborn and he mangled the pronunciation so badly she doubled over holding her ribs, or when Cole attempted to cook something more elaborate than jerky and beans and nearly set the cabin on fire, and each shared moment of lightness felt like a small rebellion against all the darkness they'd both carried for so long. But the night maze came for her on the 9th night, pulling her from sleep with a gasp that cut through the darkness like a blade, and Cole was awake instantly from his bedroll near the fire. Crossing to where she sat upright on the bed with her hands pressed against her mouth, eyes wide and unfocused, still trapped somewhere between the dream and waking. He sat beside her without asking permission, pulling her against his chest and wrapping his arms around his shaking body, feeling her heart hammer against his ribs in a frantic rhythm that gradually, slowly, began to calm as his presence anchored her back to the present. Back to the cabin and the dying fire and the safety of walls that held no wolves or blood or the particular terror of dying alone and unmourned. She didn't speak about what she'd seen in the dream, and he didn't ask. They just sat there in the dim glow of embers while her breathing returned to normal and her fingers unclenched from where they'd been gripping his shirt. And when she finally pulled back enough to look at him, her eyes were dry but haunted, reflecting firelight like dark water reflecting stars. Her hand came up slowly, hesitantly, and her fingers found the long scar that ran from his collarbone to his shoulder, a remnant of some wartime violence he rarely thought about anymore, and she traced it with a gentleness that made something in his chest constrict painfully. "Do you still wish to live alone?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper but carrying weight that seemed to fill the entire cabin. And the question hung between them like a choice that once made couldn't be unmade, a doorway that once stepped through would close behind them forever. Cole felt the emotional flood building inside him like pressure behind a dam that had been holding for 3 years, all the grief and guilt and self-imposed isolation crashing against the undeniable truth that he didn't want to be alone anymore, that somewhere in the process of saving her life and having her see straight through his carefully constructed walls, he'd stopped being the ghost he'd tried so hard to become and remembered what it felt like to be human and connected and terrifyingly vulnerable to another person's presence. He reached up and covered her hand with his where it still rested against his scar, pressing her palm flat against the proof that he'd survived things that should have killed him. And when he leaned forward, their foreheads touched first, a moment of connection that felt more intimate than anything physical, a recognition that passed between them without words about the enormity of what they were choosing. Their kiss, when it came, was inevitable and careful and deep, tasting of whiskey and wood smoke and something sweeter that might have been hope or might have been the particular flavor of two broken people deciding to be broken together rather than alone. And Cole felt years of carefully maintained distance dissolve like frost under direct sun, felt himself opening to the possibility that maybe survival wasn't the only thing worth living for, that maybe connection and risk and the terrifying vulnerability of caring about someone were worth more than the cold safety of isolation. Afterward, with her breathing still uneven and her forehead pressed against his so he could feel her words as much as hear them, Tala whispered the line that would define everything that came after, her voice carrying quiet certainty that brooked no argument or doubt. "You belong with me now," she said, not as a question or request, but as a claiming, a statement of possession that was somehow also a gift, an acknowledgement that belonging was something you chose to give rather than something that could be taken. "If you want to be mine." Cole's answer came without hesitation, the words he'd been too afraid to say finally breaking free from where he'd kept them locked behind walls of guilt and self-punishment. And when he spoke, his voice was rough with emotion but absolutely steady, carrying the weight of a vow made in firelight and witnessed by no one but the woman in his arms and whatever gods might be listening. "I want to be yours," he said, and felt the truth of it settle into his bones like coming home after a lifetime of wandering, like finally understanding that redemption wasn't something you earned through suffering but something you accepted when someone loved you enough to see past your sins and choose you anyway, scars and ghosts and all the broken pieces you thought could never be made whole again. 3 nights later, Cole woke to the smell of smoke cutting through the clean desert air like a warning bell, acrid and wrong in a way that bypassed conscious thought and went straight to the survival instincts he'd honed through years of warfare and isolation. And he was rolling out of bed with his rifle in hand before his mind fully registered what was happening, moving toward the window where orange light flickered against the darkness like a wound torn in the night. The corral was burning, flames climbing the wooden rails with hungry speed, and through the smoke he could see 3 figures moving with purpose, not the chaotic movement of accident, but the deliberate positioning of men executing an attack they planned down to the last detail. And even before he saw Red Hawk's face illuminated by firelight, Cole knew exactly who had come and why they'd chosen fire as their weapon, understanding that this wasn't about killing him quickly but about destroying everything he'd built and taking back what Red Hawk believed was stolen. Tala was already awake beside him, her hand steady on the pistol he'd taught her to shoot over the past week, and there was no fear in her eyes when she looked at him, only cold calculation and the fierce determination of someone who'd been expecting this moment and had spent days preparing for it rather than hoping it wouldn't come. They talked through this scenario in quiet voices while cleaning weapons and checking ammunition, mapping out angles and positions and contingencies with the grim practicality of people who understood that Red Hawk's pride wouldn't let him walk away, that some men nurse their wounds until they fester into something that demands blood as payment. And now all those careful plans shifted from theoretical to immediate as smoke began seeping under the cabin door and the sound of panicked horses screaming filled the night. Cole moved first, kicking open the door and dropping low as an arrow hissed through the space where his head had been a heartbeat earlier, and Tala was right behind him, rolling left while he went right, both of them using the smoke and darkness as cover while they separated and flanked outward in the pattern they practiced until it became muscle memory. She reached the burning corral with her shirt pulled over her mouth against the smoke, raised the pistol with both hands the way he'd taught her to compensate for the weapon's kick, and fired a single shot that blew the gate latch apart in a shower of splinters and metal, and the horses that had been trapped inside exploded outward in a stampede of terror and survival instinct, their hooves thundering against packed earth as they scattered the 3 attackers who'd been advancing on the cabin. With weapons drawn, Red Hawk went down hard under the shoulder of Cole's big roan stallion, rolling away at the last second to avoid being trampled but losing his bow in the chaos, and his 2 companions were forced to dive behind the water trough and woodpile respectively as the horse stampede turned their coordinated attack into desperate scrambling for cover. Cole used the confusion exactly as they planned, flanking left with his rifle raised and positioning himself behind the stone well where he had clear sight lines to both warriors, his voice cutting through the noise of fire and panicked animals with deadly calm when he shouted that the next man who moved toward a weapon would be the last move he ever made. And something in his tone, the absolute certainty of someone who'd killed before and would do it again without hesitation if forced, made both warriors freeze with their hands visible and empty. But Red Hawk was beyond reason or surrender, his face twisted with rage and humiliation as he pushed himself upright and saw Tala standing near the ruined corral gate with smoke swirling around her like something elemental, and he charged at her with a roar that was more animal than human, pulling his knife mid-stride and lunging with all the fury of a man who'd tied his entire sense of worth to possessing something he'd been publicly denied. Tala didn't run or call for help. She shifted her weight the way generations of Apache warriors had taught their children to move, turning his momentum against him as she sidestepped and drove her elbow into his ribs with enough force to crack bone. And when he stumbled and came at her again with a knife raised high, she caught his wrist, twisted it with brutal efficiency, and used his own falling weight to slam him face first into the dirt where she planted her knee between his shoulder blades and pressed the pistol barrel against the base of his skull. The tableau held for 3 heartbeats. 4. The only sounds the crackling of dying fire and Red Hawk's labored breathing. And then hoofbeats announced new arrivals, and the elder appeared out of the darkness with 4 more warriors flanking him, having followed Red Hawk from the camp because he'd suspected exactly this kind of desperate, honor-destroying attack. The old man's face when he surveyed the scene, his daughter standing victorious over the warrior who'd tried to claim her by force, the burning corral and scattered horses and the undeniable evidence of who had been the aggressor and who had merely defended what was theirs, showed disappointment so profound it seemed to age him years in the span of moments. "She refused you," the elder said to Red Hawk, his voice carrying the weight of final judgment, speaking in English so there could be no misunderstanding by anyone present. "Her choice is law. It has always been law, and you have brought shame on yourself and dishonor to those who taught you better." He nodded to 2 of his warriors who dismounted and hauled Red Hawk roughly to his feet, blood streaming from his nose and his eyes burning with hatred that would probably never die but had finally been rendered powerless. "You are banished from our lands," the elder continued. "You will take nothing but the horse you rode and the knowledge that you destroyed yourself through your own stubborn refusal to accept what could not be changed." But when the elder turned to face Cole and Tala, his expression shifted into something more complex, respect mixed with concern and a kind of weary wisdom that came from understanding how the world actually worked versus how it should work. "My daughter has chosen her path and I honor that choice," he said, his eyes moving between them with the careful assessment of someone measuring the strength of a bond and finding it genuine. "But others may not accept this union. There are those among our people and yours who will see only betrayal and taboo, who will come not for honor but for blood." He paused, letting the weight of his warning settle. "Leave this valley or prepare to fight for it, because the shadows I spoke of before have grown longer, and not all battles announce themselves with fire in the night." 6 months later, the cabin stood transformed, no longer the hollow refuge of a man waiting to die, but a home built by two people who'd chosen each other and then chosen to fight for what they'd built, and the evidence of their shared labor showed in every expanded wall and mended fence post, in the garden plot Tala had planted with seeds traded from a passing merchant, and the new corral Cole had constructed twice as strong as the one that burned, designed to withstand not just fire but whatever other trials the future might bring. The horses had returned gradually over the weeks following the attack, drawn back by familiar territory and the patient coaxing of voices they recognized, and now they grazed peacefully in the evening light, their presence a kind of benediction that said safety had been restored and maintained through vigilance and the particular kind of strength that came from not facing the world alone. They sat together on the porch they'd built that spring, watching the sun sink behind distant mesas and paint the sky in shades of orange and purple that seemed almost too beautiful to be real, and Cole found himself thinking about the man he'd been 6 months ago, the ghost who'd believe isolation was the only answer to grief, who'd convinced himself that wanting anything beyond mere survival was a betrayal of the dead. "I regret only the years I spent hiding," he said quietly, his hand finding Tala's where it rested between them, their fingers interlacing with the easy comfort of a gesture repeated so often it had become unconscious, and the admission carried weight because it acknowledged not just what he'd lost but what he'd almost missed entirely by choosing to stop living before his body caught up with the decision. Tala turned to look at him, her face soft in the fading light, and when she spoke her voice carried the certainty of someone who'd spent considerable time thinking about fate and choice and the invisible threads that connected one moment to another across vast distances and unlikely circumstances. "You were meant to find me," she said, squeezing his hand gently, "and I was meant to save you too, not from wolves or fire but from the idea that you didn't deserve to be saved at all." She leaned her head against his shoulder, settling into the space between his arm and chest that might have been designed specifically to hold her, and they sat there as darkness gathered and the first stars appeared overhead like promises written in light. Inside the cabin, their fire crackled with the particular sound of seasoned wood burning clean and hot, throwing warmth into corners that had been cold for too long, and the night around them held only the peaceful sounds of a land at rest, no smoke or screaming or the thunder of approaching danger. Just wind moving through sage and the distant call of a night bird and the quiet breathing of two people who'd found each other in the worst possible circumstances and built something worth defending from the wreckage of their separate griefs. Their life was secure not because the world had become safer or because threats had vanished, but because they'd fought for it together and would keep fighting for it as long as necessary. And that made all the difference. If this story of survival, choice, and love against impossible odds moved something in you, there are more tales like this waiting on our channel. Stories of people who refused to accept the lives others chose for them and carved out their own destinies in the unforgiving beauty of the American West. So join us again soon for another journey into the heart of what it means to fight for what matters most.